Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight I have a collection of terrifying night stories for your listening pleasure, and if you need more audio to listen to, you can always download the Mort's Bedtime Stories app for hundreds of hours of content. I hope you guys really like it, available on iOS and Android. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlights, and let the darkness take control. I've been working armed security for nearly a decade now, but I still remember working unarmed when I started out in my early 20s. I worked my way to a trusted position with my agency, where at 22 years old, I was assigned to the Colorado Springs Deaf and Blind School. At the time, only senior, more experienced officers were permitted to work there at all, but I was given the 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. shifts, Monday night through Saturday morning. A little backstory on the Deaf and Blind School. It was opened in the early 1870s and was where the burdened children of the state were sent to learn and live, but many were put to work there as laborers working fields or manufacturing items. Because of a number of ailments, accidents, or pre-existing health conditions, a large number of children and staff passed while there, to where, in the early 1880s, a small cemetery was created and formed at the intersection of Pikes Peak Avenue and Institute Street. Growing up in Colorado Springs, I was always told ghost stories about the flesh-eating bacteria on stuffed, taxidermied animals, ghosts walking in buildings, and the haunted service tunnels below the school connecting to the old train depot. But I never really believed it. Fast forward to my third month posted there, 2 nights before my 21st birthday, and a full week before students returned for the full semester for actual special needs schooling. And I had my first encounter in the gym, while checking the boys' locker rooms. A solid black figure ran past the showers. I rushed to find the intruder, not knowing what I would have done to it when I found it, as I was completely unarmed except for a flashlight. After clearing the building twice and checking all the doors multiple times, I took it as my imagination. The night of my birthday is when everything got much weirder. The shift change went as normal, and everything was fine up until 2:30 a.m. Property and building check-ins. When I went into the carriage house top floor, where the school stores all the spare desks and modern school equipment, it appeared that a person was standing in the back corner near the older stairs. I shouted at the figure and began to charge towards him. In a frenzy, I hurried to cut him off at the first floor door, but when I got to the door, it was still locked with the interior bolt. I searched the first floor when I found the doors to the service tunnel opened. On my first day, I was told not to enter into the tunnels alone, as they expanded for miles in a labyrinth. And before I went in, I didn't contact a supervisor. I felt as if I had walked for hours, but only a few minutes, which is when I hear in a very soft voice, almost childlike, "Happy birthday, Mr. Officer." The next thing I knew, my very angry supervisor, the school's maintenance director, and 2 CSPD officers were shaking me by the shoulders. My supervisor then informed me I missed my 3 a.m. check-in and was sitting in a corner of the tunnels in the dark for over 3 hours. We all left the tunnels and carriage house to see that the sun was beginning to rise. Later that day, my boss reassigned me to a different location after I was cleared from a doctor to work. I don't fully know what I saw or what was in those buildings, but it still gives me the chills, and I'll never forget the voice that made me black out for so long. "Happy birthday, Mr. Officer." When I was younger, I had an agency job cleaning buses at the local depot. The pay was abysmal, but it was a chill job where you were left to your own devices most of the time. The fleet was mostly modern, but there were a few ancient double-deckers kept around for less grueling duties. One of those buses in particular was haunted. The other cleaners and I would often hear people walk around on the top deck while cleaning the bottom, and when you were on the top deck, you'd sometimes hear footsteps slowly coming down the stairwell. They would always stop once they hit the top step. Some nights you'd hear the distinctive creaking sound of the destination blind being cranked from the driver's cabin too, but when you ran down, the blind or its handle wouldn't have moved an inch. One night I was on my knees sweeping up broken glass with a dustpan and brush when I noticed something from the corner of my eye. Behind the seat I was sweeping in front of, I could see a pair of legs. They were as solid as any other pair of legs, and I remember that they were wearing, very clearly, green corduroy trousers, dark socks, and brown brogues. They then began to bend. I was crapping myself and fell back with my eyes firmly closed. Then I dared myself to reopen them. There was nothing there. I finished as quickly as possible and moved on to the next bus. Over a cup of tea, I told the other cleaners I'd seen something weird on that bus, and she just looked at me and went, "Were they green legs?" I never saw those legs again. But apparently she saw them a few times. Always just the legs. She never dared to look up and just looked away until they disappeared. I worked as a security guard at a YMCA as an 18-year-old kid. It was a bit of a joke job as the hostel part of the building was being used as an informal social housing, i.e. runoffs from the prisons or vulnerable people. The police would visit around 3 times a week and take people away who were causing problems, and many were ex-cons or on drugs. The rest of the buildings, i.e. gym, exercise hall, small canteen, was all closed up, and the lights turned out at night. My job was to work 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., checking these buildings every few hours, and also do a walkthrough of the hostel to check that nothing was up. There had been a spat of suicides just before I got there, and in the previous week I had been listening to a distraught brother for an hour on the phone as he begged me to check on his sibling who had threatened to kill himself several times. So anyway, I was on my walkthrough on the bottom floor. All the lights were off. Everything was quiet. To access the bottom floor, I needed to take the elevator down to the basement level. It was an old goods elevator, not for public use. I got down, did my walkthrough, and was on the corridor in sight of the elevator when it pinged and opened, even though I was alone and had not called it. It was covered in blood. When I got to it, there was blood all over the glass mirrors, a little well of blood near the control panel, and blood over the keys. It looked like someone had been murdered. There was no body or tissue, just blood. Suitably freaked out, I jumped in as quickly as I could and pinged up to the reception level. When I got out, I went straight to the desk and informed them what I had seen. The guy there was pretty unwilling to help, but we agreed we should call the police and an ambulance, and as we were discussing this, a different elevator pinged and opened right in front of us, and a guy who looked like a zombie walked out. His face and head was a big welt of blood, and he was on crutches. He looked very confused and fell right in front of us. Basically, this guy was a very high drug addict who tried to take the stairs up to his room in the hostel, fell over and cut his head right open, got concussed, and got onto the wrong elevator, pressed to go up a level, but when he got there, had fallen onto the control panel and sent it back down to the basement where I'd seen it, only after managing somehow to get out at the floor above. He'd been wandering around the place, leaving a trail of blood in his wake, trying to find help. We called an ambulance, and I was severely freaked out. I'm a 27-year-old male who lives in eastern Kentucky. I work as the head of security for a chemical company. I signed an NDA, so I can't reveal what the company's name is. But I can say that it's a production plant and warehouse in the middle of nowhere. And when I say middle of nowhere, I mean at least 10 miles from the nearest town. I always thought it was kind of weird to have security guards at a factory so far from town, but I digress. I usually work with another security guard who was hired within the last year. He's one of those guys who takes his job too seriously. I had been at this position for about 5 years, and most of my 12-hour shifts consisted of checking video feed, patrolling grounds, sometimes redirecting delivery trucks to the nearest rest stop as we didn't take deliveries at night, and generally slacking off and browsing 4chan and Kiwi farms on company time. The way the factory is laid out is there is a small wing for offices in the front, with the employee parking right next to it. Behind that is a break room, which leads out to the production floor, which leads to the 2 warehouses. One for standard safe chemicals, the other is for flammable chemicals, and outside in the back are 4 very large silos, which are used to store sort of material. The whole facility, of course, is fenced, with barbed wire for added measure. One night in December of 2020, I was doing my usual routine of slacking off. I was sitting in my office browsing Kiwi farms and enjoying some dipping tobacco when my company-issued radio went off. "Hey Alex, you got anything on the cameras up there? I heard some movement out here in the warehouse." It was the other guard. I looked over towards my monitors and switched to the warehouse camera. I didn't see anything except for the other guard walking around, shining his flashlight. "Nah man, I don't see anything. You're probably just hearing stuff. Probably one of the ventilation units kicking on." "Yeah, you're probably right. I don't see anything anyway." I turned my attention away from the monitors and went back to wasting my time, as I still had 6 hours left on my shift. I began to get bored, so I reached into my backpack to pull out a can of computer duster and got ready to take a fat rip. Right before I could, I heard the motion sensor alarm go off, signifying that there was a truck trying to pull into our receiving dock. I got on the radio and asked the other guard to go up to the gate and send the trucker on his way to the rest stop until morning. "Roger." I go up to take a dump in the front restroom. Taking only my flashlight with me, I walked out of the office and started down the stairs, and started to make my way across the production floor, opening and closing the overhead metal doors to prevent fires from spreading as I went. I shut the last overhead door behind me, and was passing the area where all of the forklifts were parked and charging, when my radio cracked on. There isn't a truck out here. You sure the sensor went off?" I started to get annoyed, thinking he was messing with me. "Yes, it definitely went off. I'm going to use the restroom, so my radio's going to be off for a few minutes. Go ahead and make your rounds in the offices and parking lot, and then walk the fence perimeter and check the silos." I then shut my radio off. I got into the restroom, and while I was doing my business, I heard a loud metallic clang, like something large hitting the floor. I wasn't sure what it could have been, but it startled the hell out of me. I finished up and started back towards my office, turned my radio back on, and asked the other guard, "Did you hear a clang by any chance?" "Nah, I'm out walking the perimeter right now. Care if I go on break when I'm done?" "Go ahead," I say. I was going to go ahead and make my rounds anyway. "I'll be in the warehouses if you need me." "Roger." I walk back up to the office to grab my phone and a clipboard, with an incident report sheet in case anything had actually fallen. I put an earphone in and start listening to some black metal and hear some thunder roar outside. I thought to myself, well, maybe that's the noise I heard. I open the overhead door to the front warehouse and walk inside, then close it behind me. The higher-ups always make a big deal about us just leaving them open, and I always thought it was a waste of time. I'm absent-mindedly walking down the corridors of the warehouse, thinking about how badly I need a smoke. I was in the non-flammable warehouse, so figured I could get away with it, as long as the other guard wasn't in the office and checking the camera feed. So I lit up the cigarette and sat down on top of an empty metal drum. I took my earphones out and thought I could hear footsteps. I brushed it off as myself being overworked and too tired for my own good. I finished my cigarette and continued my rounds. Now keep in mind, This is a chemical productions plant, so there are all kinds of chemicals that have very distinct but not pleasant smells in this place, especially in the warehouse. But I caught a whiff that seemed to be out of place. It kind of smelled like sulfur. We don't work with anything that has sulfur in it, as far as I know anyway, and once again I brushed it off and kept walking. My earphone battery was dead, so I took it out and put it back in my pocket. I had finished my rounds in the front warehouse and was about to start in the back one, when after a few minutes I made my way out to the silos to make sure the top hatches were still closed and sealed, when my radio went off again. Just the beep you hear before the other person talks. I was waiting to hear the other guard say something, but he didn't. I called back, "Everything good?" but got no reply. I turned it off and back on, hoping that would fix the issue, but still no dice. When I turned it back on, it began making static noises and wouldn't stop until I turned it off. Only when I took the batteries out did it stop, and I once again brushed it off. I made my rounds in the back of the warehouse uneventfully and made my way out across the silos. It was pouring with rain at this point, so I wanted to get done and back inside as soon as I could. The worst part is that the silos are over 50 feet tall. Luckily, the tops are all connected by a metal catwalk. I climbed up the staircase as quickly as I could, made my check, and started heading down. While I was walking down, my radio started to crackle again. I thought it was weird, since I'd already taken the batteries out. I get back inside and start making my way back to the office, when I hear footsteps. It sounds like someone's running towards me. I point my flashlight in that direction and see the other guard running away. He's as white as a piece of paper, so I tell him to slow down. "The hell are you doing, man? Someone's in here, dude. I tried reaching you on the radio, but I couldn't get a hold of you." I didn't believe him, but still I was his boss and still had to hear him out. "All right, let's go back to the office. You can tell me what happened, and if we have to call the sheriff's department, then we will." He seemed to take comfort in my words, even though I was really just trying to be polite to calm him down. We sat in my office, and he relayed his story. "When I was walking back from break, I heard someone call my name from outside the fence. I was confused, so I turned around to see who was calling for me, but no one was there. So I kept walking. I got to the office door and tried to put in the passcode, but it was unresponsive, so I used the manual key to get in. After I went to close the door, I felt something stop it from closing. Like if someone put their foot in front of the door. I heard someone call my name again, but no one was there. Then the door slammed shut by itself. By then I figured maybe someone from day shift came in to mess with us, but there are no cars." He got cut off mid-sentence by the receiving doorbell ringing. It had to be rang manually, and is only there so the shipping and receiving guys know when a trucker needs to be let in. It only rings for as long as the button is held down, and it rang close to a whole minute. I switched the camera feed to outside cameras and saw nothing on any monitors, and we have cameras at every door. "Screw this," I hear, and I turn around to see the other guards stand up and walk out. "I'm out here. I quit. I didn't sign up for this." I was starting to get spooked myself because I'd never seen anything like this happen before. I didn't bother trying to stop him from leaving. I just told him I'd make sure the gate was open. Haven't seen him since. I figure maybe if I cut the power and turn it back on, the issues will stop coming up. I walked to the plant manager's office and dig around for his extra set of keys. I found them in one of his drawers and head towards the room with all the fuse boxes and breakers in it. I walked into the small room with all of the breakers and fuse boxes and started looking for anything that could have been the master power switch. After looking for a few minutes, I noticed it had gotten considerably colder. It was normally pretty toasty inside the building, but it almost felt like I was standing outside again. I started to really wonder what was going on, and just started flipping switches. After hitting one, everything was cut off. The doorbell started going again though, and I hadn't even switched the power back on. The very second before I flipped the switch to turn the power back on, I heard a loud crash. It wasn't coming from inside the building, but that's all I could tell. I flipped the switch and nothing happened. This is where it gets anticlimactic. I started to panic, ran back into my office, locked the doors and figured I'd wait there until the plant manager sent me home in the morning. I sat there for 3 hours and nothing happened. The manager showed up, asked me what happened, and I told him the storm must have knocked the power out, and that I had caught the other guard sleeping on duty and he quit when I tried to write him up. Sorry for the anticlimactic ending, but that's all I can disclose. I wonder if the cameras managed to catch anything. If I still worked at that plant, I tried to see what I could find. I work as a nurse in a psychiatric unit, which is conveniently tucked away around the back of an old hospital. I'm on night shift at the moment, and most of the night is spent trying to convince manic patients to return to their beds. We were having a strangely quiet night. The staff usually sit in the corridor at the intersection between the male and female sides of the ward. We can hear everything that's going on better from there, and intervene quickly if need be. There's a shower room located just to the left of where we sit. It has a toilet and short wall partitions separating the showers from the far corner of the room. As we were sitting there, the doors to the shower room slowly crept open. No big deal. We got up, closed it again, and went on with the night. It happened again, and about an hour later again. We thought nothing of it. After closing the door a second time, though, we soon heard the sounds of running water. I got up to check and found the tap in the shower room was running. I thought it must have been faulty, but when I tried to turn it off, it spun easily and stopped running water. Feeling a little freaked out now, I checked around the partition of the shower in case a client was, somehow, hiding there, but there was no one. When I turned to walk back, I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck and heard what sounded like gas hissing behind me. I glanced back around and checked the shower, which seemed to work fine, and just assumed there was trapped air or something happening. The next night, we were sitting in the same place, and again, it was an unusually quiet night, until around 2 a.m., when we heard a massive bang and then a dull thud, as if something had hit against a wall and then slid to the floor. The noise seemed to be quite close, and we hurriedly looked through each dormitory and individual patient's room, expecting that one of the patients had fallen, but everyone was still soundly asleep. Apart from one patient who told us she had trouble sleeping the last few nights and asked to watch some television in the sitting room. We continued with our search but couldn't seem to find anything to explain the sound and sat back down in the corridor where we started to talk about ghosts and joking about being haunted. The patient, who couldn't sleep, asked if she could smoke in the toilet. We occasionally let people do this during the night as we aren't allowed to let them out of the unit after 10 p.m. And trying to tell an avid smoker they can't have a cigarette is a sure way to start a fight that'll cause everyone to wake up. We said she could have a quick one in the shower room before going back to bed, and she asked for one of us to come in with her. When we asked why, she explained that it's because it freaks her out, that there are spirits in there that are trying to come through the mirror. We hear stuff like this all the time from patients on a regular basis, so we don't think much of it, offered her some reassurance and agreed to go to the bathroom with her. While we were in there, she talked about seeing the ghost of a man in her room, which kept her up at night. She then stopped talking abruptly and looked confused before going over to peer around the partition. I asked her what was wrong and she shushed me and asked me in a whisper if I heard what she heard. I admitted I couldn't hear anything. Again, it's a common occurrence for people to talk about auditory hallucinations on our ward, but asked her what she could hear. She said she thought she heard a dripping sound, but there was no running water, and when she checked behind the partition, she heard a hissing sound. I suggested she finish her cigarette and go back to bed, and she asked for some medication to calm her down, then said, "Man, I hate that bathroom. The door opens and closes itself, you know." After she went back to bed, I was telling the other staff about this, and we were joking about how much of a freaky coincidence it all was. We were still discussing it when day staff came in. When the first nurse arrived, she came over to ask us how the shift was, and we asked her if she believed in ghosts in a jokey way. She said she didn't, but that she had some bad memories of the wards that really freaked her out. She told us the worst thing she ever saw was 20 years ago when she was doing the hourly checks on the ward, just to check on each patient every hour to make sure they're okay. She couldn't find one patient and went to the shower room because she could hear running water. She checked around the partition and found the guy lying dead in a pool of blood in the shower. He had hacked himself to death with 2 blades, an obviously very unwell man. The nurse told us that ever since that happened, a few times she's gone into the shower room and felt a sudden rush of cold air. It was like someone was trying to run past her. I was on night shift when this following story happened. There's usually skeleton staff on over the night, 2 trained nurses and 3 or 4 nursing assistants. We had a patient with an eating disorder on the ward. At this time, she required constant observation to make sure she wasn't micro-exercising or purging. At night, we'd usually wait until she'd fallen asleep, and then position a member of staff just outside the dormitory she shared with 3 other patients, so that patients had a little more privacy to sleep throughout the night. Our ward is in a T-shape, with a male corridor and a female corridor at either end, and the nursing station at the center. We all sat at the center of the T-junction, so we could see and hear down each end of the corridor, and we had 1 member of staff sat outside the female dormitory at the very end of the female corridor. The chair the staff member sat on had its back to the fire door at the end of the corridor. Facing along towards us, we all took turns sitting there overnight. It was a fairly quiet night, with all patients sleeping soundly, a rarity in most cases. We usually had whispered conversations in the corridors amongst each other just to keep us going, and on one occasion, I was sitting on the observation chatting with a colleague when she looked up behind me confused. I asked her what was up, and she said she thought she saw someone moving on the outer side of the fire door. There was a small round window on the door looking out at the trees and path leading around to the bins and back of the unit. I told her to stop creeping me out, and we laughed about it, talking about the last night we had when all this stuff happened, when she looked up startled. She said she was positive something moved past the glass, and she dared me to get up and look outside. I was in the middle of not so politely declining this request when I heard a thud on the fire door behind me like it had just been kicked. I froze and we exchanged looks of horror, just as there was a very gentle knock at the door. Needless to say, we both freaked. I jumped out of my chair and she came hurrying towards me, both of us full of nervous giggles. It took some persuasion from both of us before we managed to go and look out the window. Of course, there was nothing there. The night went on and we continued to joke and speculate about what we saw and heard. She brought a chair up to sit next to me outside the dormitory for emotional support, and I insisted I wasn't going to look out the window for the rest of the night. A few hours later, someone else was sat on the observation, and I was chatting in the middle of the junction with another nurse. One of our colleagues steps out of the office at the junction, looks up at the corridor and gasps. She pointed at the fire door and said she was sure she saw someone with a pale face staring through the window before it vanished. A new round of speculation started as we theorized as to what it could be when the door to the female dormitory burst open and a patient came stumbling out of the corridor, running past the nurse's assistant on the observation and straight to the corridor at us. She looked terrified and half asleep, so we assumed she was sleepwalking. We caught her as she reached us at the junction and began attempting to soothe her, but she kept trying to push past our hands, muttering in a scared voice, "No, there's someone there, there's someone there." We eventually tried to engage with her, but she was either in too deep a sleep or too groggy. Eventually we managed to calm her down and return her to the dormitory, but when she got to her bed, she stopped again and asked if the nurse had to stand over her all night. We assured her there was no one standing over her all night, and she looked confused but allowed us to settle her into bed, where she promptly fell asleep. Our adrenaline was running high at this point, and matters weren't helped when the haunted tap started playing up again, turning itself on in the cursed bathroom. We were so freaked out, one of the nurses refused to walk around the ward on her own while others remained skeptical about all of it. It was maybe a week later when we were back on shift, when we had the same setup, with one member of staff sat alone at the observation and the rest of us in the middle of the corridor, when a nursing assistant, who hadn't been there the first night, stepped out of the office behind us and shouted, "Who the hell is that?" She was loud enough to make us all jump, and we looked down the corridor to where she was pointing at the fire door, and a poor, pale, freaked out staff member sat in front of it. The nursing assistant then explained that, as she had stepped out the office, she had glanced at the fire door and thought she saw something white shining in. She then did a double take and realized it was a pale face of a blonde woman pressed up against the window. The nursing assistant said that she had shouted and the face dropped down, as if the person or whatever it was had fallen. We all went together to peer out, and of course there was nothing there. I called the site manager. There was always one manager on call at nights to handle any big issues, and suggested there may have been a person going around the building looking through the windows. She didn't seem that concerned with the story, and just suggested that no staff leave the building until morning, which is a typical rule anyway. Of course, a paranormal encounter isn't the only explanation for this. A living, breathing person going around staring through our windows was creepy enough, especially since the fire door didn't have a lock and was often blown open by the wind. Another week or so passed, and a different staff rotated on shift. I told one of the nurses all the stories that had happened to us on the shift, and she was petrified, saying that she always got an eerie feeling on the ward at night. Later that night, a member of staff from another ward on the unit popped in to borrow something. He had worked at the hospital for almost 30 years and had been in every ward on the unit at some point. The nurse I was working with told him that she was freaked out and asked if he had experienced any hauntings on the ward. He seemed amused and asked, "Like what?" She told him about the taps turning on and off, about the patient claiming there were spirits in the mirrors. He seemed skeptical and shrugged it off, but agreed it was a new one to him. He then said he'd never had any hauntings or weird experiences on the ward, but said that a lot of the staff through the years had complained about spooky stuff always happening at the female dormitory at the end of the corridor. Again, I'm not necessarily claiming it all had ghosts or something, but it was definitely unsettling, to say the least, while on night shift. I am an armed, uniformed security officer in my city. Well, 2 years ago, my company was providing services for a motel named the Night's Inn. The motel was preparing to shut down for a massive remodel, as well as code and structural updates. Now, the motel was previously 2 separate motels, but when the Night's Inn bought it, they merged the properties into one. During nearly 20 years of running between both of the original motels, they saw some rather negative events. This location just happens to be within walking distance from the county jail, so when a number of persons were released from custody, they found their way over to this motel over the years. Murders, drug overdoses, and suicides were all reported on this property. All these dark events left negative imprints on these grounds. Fast forward to when I worked on the property during the overnight hours, and the 3 events during these separate shifts I worked, and the one I responded to as a cover officer. The first few went very slowly and boring. No one had told my staff the history of the property at this point. Well, the second to last week of operation, I was helping the on-duty night auditor prepare the morning breakfast spa, and the kitchen was in part of the building where a long shut-down restaurant once was. The auditor was preparing the waffle batter and filling pitchers of orange juice, when an unopened 12-pack of canned soda exploded next to a service access stairwell that was padlocked from inside of the service hallway to the kitchen. The auditor's scream was chilling, as well as deafening. Well, due to some of the less than upstanding guests they'd rent rooms to, I began down the stairs to find that the doors were still secure, and no one could have entered through them. I then stuck my finger in the puddle of soda, thinking that maybe it had been overheated or something causing them to burst, but no, it was slightly cool. As I look at the auditor still shaking, holding a small kitchen knife trying to calm her down, we both heard a loud little girl giggle, but it sounded unusual. We, needless to say, both bolted from the kitchen and back to the main desk. 5 minutes later, the auditor told me, "No one has checked in any kids tonight." The following weeks, and the last week of the location being open before the remodel, I was doing standard ground patrols, making sure no doors were unsecured or people fighting. Just around the time I finish, I get a call from the front desk calling a Code 6 priority. I ran back to the office, nearly tripping on the staircase in the courtyard. Once I arrived, I saw a young woman with her daughter, just the cutest little 3-year-old. The mother was crying uncontrollably, but managed to tell me her husband was not himself, that after nearly an hour in the room he pulled a knife out of nowhere and started wildly swinging it in the room and at his wife and kid. The wife said that he hates weapons and wouldn't have had one. So I began searching the grounds for the man and found him sitting in a dark corner of the courtyard area. He had the knife in his hand and was blankly staring ahead. Once the knife hit the light, I saw the blood. Then I noticed he was bleeding. I ordered he drop the knife and he slowly started walking towards me. I repeated a second time and then on the third order drew my weapon and ordered that he stop to think about his kid. Right as I did, 3 local officers sprang from behind me, 2 with their tasers drawn. In a quick happening display, I heard the deputy order, then followed taser, taser, taser. The local officer took the man into custody and was having me fill out statements when I overheard 2 of the deputies saying, "You know what, Sard? The room they are staying in had a suspicious death a few days ago, but detectives say it was a drug-induced suicide." The other deputy replied, "Huh? What are the odds this guy went nuts?" I personally think that it's a little too odd that the man commits suicide. Comes to find he cut his arms until he bled out, and then a week later a man loses his mind, cuts himself up, is unresponsive the whole time that he was being spoken to, and was just generally out of it. The most damning paranormal event in my opinion that happened was the first week closed for remodeling. I was walking around the inside and another officer stopped in to hang out on his break. I made the suggestion that we sit in the old restaurant and see if the place was for real haunted. He agreed, reluctantly. Using a spirit box app on my phone that before that night I thought I overpaid for, we sat and asked questions. For about 20 minutes nothing came through, and we joked that maybe the place wasn't haunted after all. I thought I saw something across the room, so I tried to light it up, but come to find that my flashlight battery had suddenly died. So, while sitting at the table, I pulled my taser out of the holster, and we sat in near pitch darkness in the room, and we used it to light it up. Instantly, the spirit box said, "Yellow, gun," in the same voice. Now mind you, me and this officer thought we had the same level of training, and we were fully certified through the city. But his response was, "The hell does it mean by yellow gun?" I then proceeded to place my taser on the table and turned its light on. I had never heard so many F-bombs as he stormed out the room. The final incident I'm still unsure of, but the one phrase the suspect yelled, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." 4 weeks after that motel closed, I was working a city patrol when the on-duty officer called for priority backup for all available officers on duty. "Sam 262 to Nights Inn. What's the situation?" The officer responded. 4 to 6 persons had made enter into the back building and barricaded themselves in a room. I was the first responding officer just after 3 a.m. and meet with the on-duty site officer. As we're talking and a third officer arrived, we heard 3 gunshots ring out from down the hallway. At this time, we contacted the local sheriff's office about the situation. Within minutes, Several deputies arrived in active shooter vests and helmets. They attempted to reach the room as we watched from the end of the hallway. 5 more shots rang out from the doorway, and luckily no one was struck. The deputies fell back to the end of the hallway where the 3 of us were. A supervisor for the deputies ordered 4 to watch the hallway as the rest took positions around the building. We asked what they needed to do, and he replied to block the entrances to the property, and no one comes that isn't an officer. So basically we were to keep out of the way of the impending reporters. SWAT arrived, and the deputies pulled back and SWAT took position. The whole time the suspects saw the activity from the window and holes in the door. A lieutenant with the SWAT and Public Relations office came over to me and the other guys on my staff, and while asking us what happened before, the deputy responded that we all heard from a broken window, "There will be more ghosts if you enter here tonight." Around 5 a.m, a SWAT team armored vehicle pulled up next to the back of the building, and we heard 3 thumps. SWAT shot OC shells into the room before breaching from the window doorway, and just as soon as we heard the thumps, we see the smoke and 5 of the suspects being carried out. A 6th was being rushed out on a straightboard to the ambulance. We come to find the man with the pistol in the room took his 5 friends hostage and attempted to kill himself when SWAT breached. He later died at the hospital, so I wonder if he joined the other ghosts in the motel. After that night, we no longer provided security at the Night's Inn. 8 months later, it reopened as some new age hipster hotel, and I haven't been to the property for some time now, even though I pass it whenever I work our South City patrol. I wonder how the property is, and if the paranormal activity persisted after the remodeling. I used to work as a corrections officer, and I have plenty of really creepy stuff that happened over those 5 years, but this is by far my favorite incident. I was assigned to the single-man cells wing of the jail, which is basically solitary confinement for inmates who are being punished for breaking rules within the jail. At around 5 a.m, medical call for all inmates that need medication to be escorted from my wing to medical to receive their meds. I pull out 2 guys, restrain them, and instruct them to face the wall and await the guard who will be escorting them. As the 3 of us are there, I begin to hear a woman crying. I was new to the jail and didn't think anything of it, so I'm just listening to this woman cry, when I slowly start to realize a few things. There are no females in this wing, nor in any other wing where the men are. The female wing is down the hall, sealed tight with about 3 doors in between the hall and the actual wing. There is only about 2 other males in the wing, who are asleep aside from us 3. I look up at the inmates and notice they have this kind of smile on their faces as they're watching me realize what's going on. And I ask them, "Do you guys hear that?" One of the inmates responds, "Almost every night, boss." They went on about other things that would happen in that wing. Water being turned on and off, towels being thrown down on the floor, hearing knocks on the walls. I actually had another incident that night, confirming the knocks heard on the walls in the empty cells. That same night, or rather morning, we were assigned to a certain wing, and we had to do exit door checks, which basically meant going to the exit door of the wing and checking the fire exit door to make sure it was securely fastened, and then radioing it to control every few hours. As I was making my way down a very long hall, with empty single-man cells to my left and right, I could hear knocking at the end of the hall. But it wasn't coming from the exit door, it was coming from one of the cells on the right-hand side. As I would gradually move closer, I could hear the knocks getting louder at the end of the hall. That's when I got to the end of the hall, and the knocking seemed to have gone away. So I grabbed the exit door to make sure it was secure, and a very distinct and loud knock came from the one cell on the right-hand side of me. I'd seen enough horror films to not look into the empty cell, and decide it would be best to just get out. When I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour porno store/strip club, on a night, I happened to fortunately not be working. There was an incident in the gay room. Basically, the details I gathered from the people who were working there at the time was that a big guy came in and went into the room. A few minutes later, another dude comes in basically crawling out and crying. He's screaming that there's a man in there sexually assaulting people. Now, I worked with a plethora of jacked bouncers who literally feared nothing except that back room. The bouncers all came up with excuses not to go in there and convinced a cashier friend of mine to do it. So he grabs a baseball bat that we had behind the counter and adventures into what only can be described as a dark, teemingly gay cavern of misdeeds. Now, we were all afraid to get the police involved in this kind of stuff because not only was the place mafia run, but it was also illegal to have a gay room, which was definitely the place's biggest moneymaker. We didn't want the wrath of the cops or mafiosos on us, so we never involved the police. Anyway, he gets inside and this big gentleman is wearing a mask and has all of the dudes there lined up with no pants on, and he's just taking them all, one by one, leaving them bleeding and terrified. My cashier friend Dave walks in there and starts yelling at the dude, "Dude, you can't be doing this back here." The guy starts sobbing, apologizing profusely, and runs out the store. The ambulance arrived shortly after and took a few of the guys to the hospital. This is sadly a true story, and I really hope the people involved didn't catch anything and were okay. As okay as you can be after that, of course. I used to work as a personal trainer at a very familiar gym in my city to help pay for college. The neighborhood this gym was located in has 2 other gyms across the street, so we would have a lot of clients changing from place to place. I worked the night shift since I was out of class at 6 p.m. and worked from 6:30 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Usually a lot of guys would go for experimental classes at night, and I was known for working with the bodybuilders. At around 9 p.m, this huge guy with a very arrogant posture walked in for an experimental class. The secretary immediately sent him to me, and I was more than happy to help him out, albeit I was pretty sure he already worked out and needed no help whatsoever. Weird, but okay. Throughout the whole hour, the guy would ask me very personal questions: where I lived, if I was single, what's my shoe size, and what I was working as. I politely just tried to keep our conversation focused on training and exercises and stuff. When class was over, he looked at me. "Can I have your number?" "Sorry, but I have a fiancé." "You sure? I don't usually take no as an answer." Already wishing I wasn't at work so I could just walk away. "Yeah, I'm sure, just here to help you exercise properly, nothing else." Then this guy puts his finger up my face and goes, "When I get my gun, you won't say no to me," and walked out the door. For almost a month, I needed to ask a male co-worker to go with me to the parking lot late at night, because this guy would be at the corner waiting for me to get out. He would stare at me and smile and wait for me to leave. Later, I found out he was at the gym across the street and took my car's license plate. I had to ask one of my clients that was a cop to scare him out. Until this day, I still can't get that smiling face of his out of my mind. I worked solo graveyard shift at the call center for a small security business. I see an alarm go off for the alley door. This has never happened, and I don't know how they got through the lock. I called the local security guard working and then police and watched the thief on cameras test all the doors while I waited for the guard. I was behind 3 more locked and coded doors, but it was scary hearing him go up and down the stairs to the alley through the wall. He left 5 minutes after, but it was terrifying. I wish he'd have been caught. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, you can let me know in the usual way down below. It really does mean a lot, so thank you. And if you haven't checked out the Mort's Bedtime Stories app yet, feel free to download it. It's really good. You get a lot of free stories every day, and if you want to get the full version, you can, but there's no obligation. It's a good app on its own. It doesn't need you to buy it. It's just something you can get if you want to. But please, I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. Please leave reviews on the App Store. That's always really helpful, or the Google Play Store and stuff. But yeah, let me know, guys. It really will mean a hell of a lot to me. I really enjoyed these night shift stories. I know we did them this month already, but, you guys voted for them. I've got some really cool and obscure topics coming soon as well that might interest you. You can say in the comments if this stuff is something you're interested in. But I've been compiling them for a while. Secret passages, one I'm very excited about. Phone calls from beyond the grave. Now, I know a lot of you guys might think, oh, it's all just nonsense. These stories, guys, you have to hear them. They're so good. I really like movie theatre stories. It was one of the options today. Didn't get picked, but it will definitely be in a future video just because the topic is so, so niche. I love that. Closet stories, that's going to be a good one. And I've also got avalanche and snow, airline. I've got a number of really, really cool ones that we don't often have and I'm really excited about because it's cool to break into new stuff. It can't always just be woods and camping and stalkers and stuff. I have to have a bit more substance, you know what I mean? Anyway, lots to look forward to. Let me know what you think about the app. I hope you guys have had a really wonderful Tuesday. It's Tuesday, isn't it? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.